Okay, everybody, welcome to this presentation of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School. My name is Dan Canstrom, and as faculty director of the Rappaport Center and as a professor at the law school, it's my great pleasure to personally welcome all of you to our second event of this semester. And I particularly want to welcome the students in our new inaugural seminar on law and public policy, which is connected to the Rappaport Center. I'm personally thrilled about the panel discussion that we have for you today. I should say that I actually began my career doing eviction defense work in Massachusetts courts. And I remember clearly how much that work meant to my clients, how challenging it was, how much in need of reform the legal system was even then, and the court as well. And I've also pondered over the years how much work informed my later work, which has been on deportation and on human rights issues more broadly. I think there's a deep human rights connection to the subjects we're going to talk about today. In my human rights seminar, for example, I often highlight the fact that the Constitution of South Africa, unlike that of the United States, makes clear, quote, everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing. It says the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right. No one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of court made after considering all of the relevant circumstances. Legislation may permit arbitrary evictions. That's section 26 of the American Constitution, 1996, quite different from the US Constitution. And as the Constitutional Court in South Africa once noted, quote, all the rights in our Bill of Rights are interrelated and mutually supporting. There can be no doubt that human dignity, freedom, and equality, the foundational values of our society, are denied to those who have no food, clothing, or shelter. Quote. Housing and evictions obviously have become particularly salient in light of COVID and the terrible economic challenges faced by many, especially faced by communities of color. But these issues have long been fundamentals of human rights, racial justice, societal equity, and so on. As Matthew Desmond puts it on his website, quote, without a home, everything else falls apart, end quote. Simply put, I just can't imagine more timely or more significant issues than those around evictions. And I should also note that our civil clinic at Boston College Law School does represent tenants in eviction cases and has done so with distinction for a long time. Please also understand that this presentation is part of a series. So please do visit the Rappaport Center website. And I mean this definitely not only for people in the Boston College Law School community or the Boston College community or the Boston community or the Northeast regional community or the United States community. I mean, everybody. Visit our website to see the other outstanding programs we have in store for you this semester, particularly the upcoming presentations of our senior fellows this year, who are Ajmel Qureshi from the NAACP and Howard University Law School, and John Miller from Public Citizen and formerly the Mass AG's office. Now, before I briefly introduce our excellent moderator, just a couple more details. First, the event program with bios of the panelists is in the chat function and will be posted there, as well as other valuable resources which have generously been provided by the panelists. Second, today's program is being recorded. And now it's my great honor and privilege to introduce our moderator, who has generously agreed to handle things from here. Professor Norrinda Hayat is the director of the Civil Justice Clinic at Rutgers Law School. Coming to academia, she worked as a trial attorney in the US Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Housing and Civil Enforcement section. While in the Civil Rights Division, Professor Hayat led a case that resulted in DOJ's first combined police practices and fair housing settlement. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College and her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. After graduation, she began a career in private practice, specializing in white collar and insurance litigation with Hogan and Hartson and then DLA Piper, From 2006 through 2007, she was in private practice, specializing in civil rights litigation with the firm Booth and Tucker in Philadelphia. We are tremendously honored to have you join us, Professor. I happily now turn it over to you for further introductions, and thanks to you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Canstrom, and to the Rappaport Center for inviting me and putting on this very important program. I spend a good deal of my time thinking about eviction, and as the title of this program suggests, the consequential crisis that we are in right now, as do our co-panelists, I know. And so, and many of you, if not all of you, who are participating today. So I look forward to a very rich conversation as we struggle with what have already been very appropriately described as some of the most challenging human rights issues of our time. So I don't want to take up too much time from our panelists. I'm going to quickly introduce them. Obviously, more could be said than I am going to say because of time, but please do read their full bios on the program. First, I want to introduce Callie Clark, who joins us today from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, MHP, where she joined in 2008 and worked in policy analysis, research, messaging, and communication strategy. In early 2017, she became co-director of MHP Center for Housing Data. And in 2019, Callie became the director of policy. She has extensive experience in policy analysis, web strategy, and crafting presentations for legislators, local officials, and public audiences. Next, I want to introduce you to Katie McCann, who is a community organizer at City Life Vida Urbana, a grassroots community organization committed to fighting for racial, social, and economic justice and gender equality by building working class power. Wow, right on. So she has, Katie has MSW in macro social work practice from Boston University School of Social Work, and an MPH in health policy and law and human rights and social justice from Boston University School of Public Health. Next, we are joined by Andrea M. Park, who joined the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, MLRI, as a housing and homelessness staff attorney in 2016. Prior to that, Andrea worked as an assistant attorney general in the Civil Rights and Consumer Protection Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, and she was an attorney at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau on innovative foreclosure defense project work, partnering with lawyers and community organizers. Prior to that, she was a staff attorney at Community Legal Aid in Worcester, specializing in housing, foreclosure, consumer, and bankruptcy litigation. Last but not least, Trevor Samios is a vice president at Win Companies, where he oversees the operations of Connected Communities, the organization's collective impact model for housing-based human services across its affordable and mixed income national housing portfolio. The Connected Communities team works closely with a developed network of over 1,500 national partners to develop collaborative, community-based strategies that support measurable outcomes in 6 key areas: housing stability, healthcare, education, employment, community engagement, and economic mobility. These partnerships coordinate vital resources, services, and innovative programs on behalf of 350,000 residents each year within Win Company's managed portfolio, working to relieve barriers to resource access while informing public policy decisions. We are going to start now with Callie, and she has a presentation for you, and we'll jump into conversation after these presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hayat. I'm going to, how come we always have to say this? I'm going to share my screen and and you will all be able to see my presentation, and we will go from there. Okay. I'm assuming you can see my presentation. So I will start out. So everyone's good? You can see presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great, awesome, thank you so much. So anyway, as mentioned, my name is Callie Clark. I'm the Director of Policy for the Center for Housing Data at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. We are a team focused on providing data to inform public policy conversations. So I'm happy to be here today and just be able to share with you some of the work that we have been doing around the eviction crisis during this time. So today I'm going to be walking you through some selected data from a website that my team has partnered with the Boston Indicators out of the Boston Foundation on a website called the COVID Community Data Lab. We created this website in May of 2020 to unfortunately track all of these indicators that were a result of the pandemic. So we kind of have three things that we hope to do here on the website. We have, you see this little crisis indicator right here that I have. We have up-to-date data on housing, but lots of other issues related to the COVID pandemic. And then we also have briefs if you scroll down. So I'll be kind of pulling from some of those today. And then we're also hoping that this is a space where people can access and get information so that they can use it as a jumping off point to have some data, to have good conversation about what's really going on in their community. So with that, I'm going to start us. I pulled some of the most what I thought relevant data for this conversation today. So we're going to kind of fly through that and then end with a few policy suggestions moving forward. So first, I wanted to start with some nationwide rent collection data. So again, this is nationwide. This is pulled from the National Multifamily Housing Council. So it's 11.6 million apartments across the nation. These are professionally managed apartments, so this does not account for information about, say, the two-family that I live in here. My rental information would not be included. But just wanted to give folks a sense of how have people been paying their rent during this time. So you see we start in March and it goes through January 2021. And we can see that at the beginning of the month, there are less payments coming in, but by the end of the month for all months, we're at 93% of rent paid. So again, people are getting that rent paid no matter how they have to do it. And we'll talk a little bit later about the supports that are in place in order to make sure that people have resources they need to get their landlord paid. So here are new weekly eviction filings for non-payment of rent in Massachusetts. This starts in January 2020, and actually now at the end, we're here in the second week of February. You see this big placeholder in the middle. This was the statewide eviction and foreclosure moratorium that was in place between October 20th and October 17th of 2020. So you can see there are ebbs and flows, there are peaks and troughs here. But what I'm seeing is this real, obviously, the no evictions moving forward during the this really important eviction prevention moratorium that we had in place. And then I see a big spike up as a lot of pending evictions all of a sudden were able to be filed. And I think what's really also interesting to look at is kind of the weeks following Thanksgiving or National Day of Mourning, how many of the filings went up, but now we're going back down. So I hope that we have kind of a rich conversation later about why might eviction filings be going down. Of course, that's great, but does that mean that evictions are happening not through the court system? Is there informal process? And is that something we should be worried about and keep in mind? So I also wanted to include some information, even though we're here to talk about evictions, I also wanted to make sure we started talking about foreclosures as well. I was working at my organization during the Great Recession, so I remember crunching a lot of data about evictions and foreclosures. So I pulled some information about statewide foreclosure petitions. So this is the beginning of a foreclosure process. And again, just wanted to show folks what this has looked like starting in January of 2019, going all the way until this ends in December of 2020. So as you can see, again, we have the same timeline of when the eviction moratorium was in place. There was protection against some foreclosures, but numbers are starting to tick back up. So again, just something that we are always keeping in mind, though evictions are front of the mind right now, our foreclosure is going to be the next crisis that we have to deal with. So I've showed you some data before, right, about are people paying their rent, what's going on with petitions, and then what's happening with actual filings. But I wanted to include this because this is really data about fear of imminent eviction here in Massachusetts. So this is pulled from the Census Pulse Survey, which is kind of a novel survey that's been created by the census during this time. And in the 23 weeks that they've collected information, they collect information from households, but also from small businesses to kind of report on what's happening on the ground. So what I'm showing you here is that tens of thousands of Massachusetts renters fear imminent eviction. And for the last period of time, which was week 23 of this survey, you can see a high estimate, an estimate, and a low estimate. But that estimate, I believe, was around 60,000 households in Massachusetts said that they were either very likely or likely that they would leave their current home due to eviction in the next 2 months. That was their sense of what was going on because of the handling of household finances, what was going on with COVID. So I just think that's something that we should all be keeping in mind while looking at the data, thinking about the people behind the numbers and that real fear that's shown here in this data. So what has the state been doing during this time? Well, they've been doing a lot, but one thing in particular I wanted to highlight is the state emergency rental assistance funds that are going out in communities and to households. So this is money that's being distributed. I'm showing you RAFT information, so that's rental assistance for families in transition. This was previously a $20 million program. And as you can see, for at least January 2021, we've gone way beyond $20 million going out the door. So this is showing you 2019, 2020, and then 2021 in terms of funds expended, total funds expended, and then households that are receiving this rental assistance. A few things I would highlight. Again, you can kind of see the peaks and troughs happening here. I believe the average amount that is going to a household since the beginning of the pandemic has been around $4,000 per household. But in total, I believe at least 32 million has gone out from the beginning of the pandemic to the end of 2020. So as we can see in 2021, the demand for this emergency rental assistance is immense, and the state and now federal government will be matching this with $457 million coming to Massachusetts for emergency rental assistance specifically. So I'm just going to wrap it up with some suggestions to inform policy, and hopefully these are some of the conversations we have later. My colleagues and I published a brief on the COVID Community Data Lab site, kind of looking at what's been happening since the beginning of the pandemic, and have some suggestions moving forward. Now, I'm kind of a data person, so a lot of my suggestions are obviously about data, but a few I wanted to highlight are around streamlining the delivery of emergency rental assistance. Again, we've been getting a lot of money out the door very quickly, but we need to keep getting that money out the door just as quickly. So any streamlining that can be done, I think, is be great. I'm sure Andrea or Katie will go into this more, but rationalizing the documentation for financial support. Sometimes I think the processes we have in place can be onerous. I know people are trying to fix them, but we need to get money in people's hands as soon as possible. So anything we can do there. Trevor, I'm sure will be talking about accelerating property level assistance. So I look forward to hearing more about that. And then on the data side, just increasing transparency around data, right? So what's going on with local emergency rental assistance programs? We actually have over, I believe, 90 here in Massachusetts of local funds going towards emergency rental assistance, but we need to know more about who's being assisted by those programs, how much has gone out the door. Same around just emergency rental assistance funds in general. I've noted that the State Department of Housing and Community Development has information on this eviction diversion initiative and emergency rental assistance funds, but we need more data. And then ensuring equitable assistance to emergency rental assistance. I'm sure Katie and other folks will go more into this, but again, this is so important. And meeting people where they are, making sure that we're connecting with people through trusted sources, I think is incredibly important moving forward to make sure that we are helping the people who need it the most. So with that, I'll say thank you and stop sharing and turn it over to the next person.
Thank you very much. We're going to pick up with Andrea Park adding to this conversation.
Hi, can you hear me and can you see the right thing?
We can, Andrea, thank you.
I have made that mistake before. So thank you so much. Just thank you to the Rappaport Center and Professor Canstrom for those really powerful words. I think you really highlighted the bigger picture of what we need to talk about. I think those of us who have done any kind of eviction defense or housing work or have been in housing court understand the need for these reforms, not only in the courts, not only in the legal system, in our housing system, but there is a deep human need for shelter, for a place to live. And I think I wholeheartedly agree that these things are all related. Immigration, human rights, and our ability to live with dignity starts with having a roof over our heads. So I think that is really the backdrop for a lot of what we do. And I think I'm going to kind of fly through these slides because some of them are just there for reference for later, hopefully if they're useful, but I really want to pick up on what Callie was talking about and maybe give it a different angle. We rely a lot on the types of data that Callie was talking about to do the policymaking. And I think it's important to lend that dimension to it. And I think the policy, even though you're a data person, I think the policy recommendations are really right on. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm from Mass Law Reform Institute. We are a legal aid organization, but we are a statewide policy and support center. So I used to be one of the attorneys out in the field doing the cases and going to court every week. And now I just talk to them and they help me figure out what the policies are that we need to be pushing. So I'll just add a little bit about the eviction process and what's been happening during the emergency. So as Callie mentioned, in April, the governor signed our eviction and foreclosure moratorium. And obviously the emergency started in March. And so we were a little bit behind kind of catching up to that process and knowing what it should look like. And I think that gave us the benefit of seeing what other states were doing in other localities. And I'm glad to say that we worked really hard to put together a very strong moratorium with some help from literature like of the type that Professor Hayat had written. We really emphasized all the stages of the eviction that needed to be stopped, not just this one process or this one court hearing, because that was what we were seeing play out in other states. It also paused the foreclosures that needed to happen. So if you remember the charts and that Mass Housing has put together, that dip, that pause, that stop in there. And that really was a public health measure, right? These are all, at this point, public health measures because we knew that the spread of the virus was about people moving around. Unfortunately, in our view, that moratorium expired in October. And that was as we were kind of entering what we were hearing a lot about was going to be the second wave of virus infections. At that point, up to a third of Massachusetts tenants had been unable to pay their rent. And I think it's really striking to think about that chart that shows the people who were at fear of imminent risk of eviction. I think one of the really important things to keep in mind when you see and hear about trial court numbers is that that's not the whole eviction picture, right? There are a lot of people who, I think that the high number of fear of imminent eviction and the number of cases that are filed can both be true because there are so many people who leave because they are afraid. They know they can't pay. They don't want to get taken to court. They don't understand that they have rights in court and they simply leave. And so it's very hard to define an eviction just in the terms of a court process. And after the moratorium ended, the following week, courts were open. They were open 5 days a week. Everything was very confusing for not just litigants, but for attorneys as well. It's still happening. There's hearings happening, there's mediations happening, and everything is happening on Zoom, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And there is a trial court dashboard that they have put up with information from that the courts are providing. So there have been at least 8,000 new cases. This number changes like every week, so I can't keep it up with it. But a new number that they started releasing that we've seen is the number of executions that have been issued, which is the piece of paper that the landlord would get at the end of the process that gives them the ability to move people out. And there's a significant number of these are for non-payment of rent, despite the fact that we have this federal moratorium, which I can talk a little bit more about. So as you heard from Callie, there's also, actually before we get to that, there is a federal moratorium that you may have heard about that the Centers for Disease Control put into place in September. It didn't apply to us at the time because we had our state moratorium in place, but as soon as October 17th came, the CDC became relevant here. And so unfortunately, our courts have interpreted this to mean that to apply only at the very end of the process. So it means that they should be preventing the physical removal from the home, which may account in part for some of the high numbers of executions that get handed out. But even with this CDC, the different courts across the state have not interpreted it the same way. So some of them said, you know, we're going to only get to this certain point and then we're going to stop. Others have said, I'm going to give you the execution. You just have to promise not to use it until this expires. And so it's a confusing process. Some important things to know is that it doesn't require you to provide proof of the financial hardship. It's an attestation. It's a declaration that a tenant would fill out and sign. And it doesn't require that it be related, the hardship be related to COVID. But it is still a piece of paper that people need to find, they need to fill it out, they need to swear that they have complied with it, and they need to provide it to the landlord. And those are all can be difficult steps to take. Just some more information about the criteria, which may or may, I don't think we need to cover here. The next kind of policy thing that happened is the Eviction Diversion Initiative, which Callie talked about. And this was a result of a legislative campaign that we were kind of undertaking after the moratorium, understanding that that was going to be temporary and we needed another solution to really get out of the crisis. And I think the real problem there wasn't any money that we could point to that we had available. And as many states and localities dealing with the same question found, it wasn't a problem that any one city, any one county, or any one state could really solve on their own. You know, there's millions and billions and maybe trillions of dollars owed from tenants on up to mortgages. And, you know, the entire system looks very shaky when you think about all the money that's owed. And I think locally that comes down to who is kind of left with the holding the bag, right? Who needs to be the one to kind of pony up all the money. And this is something I think Trevor will be able to shed some light on, which I think will be interesting. So the governor put the diversion initiative into place, and the legislation really stalled, I think, because he gave about a week and he said, we're going to let the moratorium expire, but we're going to have this go into place. And as Callie said, there were a lot of resources that went into this. It was a good, you know, there's a lot of important things that come out of this. There's some legal resources that were made available. There's funding for different homelessness prevention programs, and there was increased funding for the RAFT program, which is the primary rental assistance mechanism here. And so the problem with that was, I think, initially that it didn't have any time to start. So it was announced, but there were, you know, hundreds of people who were going to be hired who weren't hired yet. And so while it was a good plan, I think from our perspective, kind of announcing it and stopping the moratorium at the same time made it difficult to really make those resources real. Following that, we were pushing for this other legislation, which really stalled, I think, in large part because the governor had announced a plan to deal with the crisis. But the legislature did eventually, in the budget process, which was very much delayed last year and didn't get done until the very end of the year, include some more budget for eviction protections. And so in the technical name is Chapter 257 of the Acts of 2020, which really rolls off the tongue. Landlords now are required to send certain information to a tenant and information about RAFT, information about the CDC, about the protections that are in place in order to file their case. And any tenant who has applied for any of this assistance should get a continuance of the case. They shouldn't be allowed to be evicted until they get an answer, yes or no, on their rental assistance application. And the reason for that was that the rental assistance applications had really skyrocketed and there was just a huge backlog and there was only so much people can do that faster. And so I think that all of these things came together. And I think Callie correctly identified the two big components of this, which were the court system, which is the place in which tenants may be thrown out of their homes, and the rental assistance money, which is the other piece of the puzzle. So if that all seemed really confusing, that's because it's really confusing. And so I think even in Massachusetts, where we had a fairly uniform system, we are now kind of joining the other states where moratoriums have expired, and there's kind of a patchwork of protection. And I think what we have seen out of this, and I think Katie's going to talk about a study that showed the real human cost of stopping the moratoriums and ending them maybe before it was time, is that these evictions are still happening. So like I said, the eviction diversion initiative didn't really have time to get going. There have been, a lot of executions that have issued. The CDC order requires people to submit something that can be a barrier for people who are undocumented and don't want to touch a government form, who can't speak English, who have no or low literacy, people with disabilities. And the courts are really doing things in the way that they think they should, which means that they're not uniform. And so it's really hard to kind of keep track of what we need to be advising people, how we're going to be litigating cases. And like I had mentioned, a lot of people move out just because they know that they think there's no hope. And so, so I'm going to skip. There's some resources here. We're working on another bill. I'm going to leave this, I think, for later. And I just want to add, and there's some resources here for people to access, and I think you'll be able to look at this on your own. But I just want to add that to what others have said, what Callie has been saying, is that there's a lot of parallels here, I think, on the need for data and for transparency. I think that we're seeing a lot in Massachusetts play out with the vaccine rollout, and just getting the money out to people, getting it out quickly is very important. But I think it also matters who we're prioritizing and how we are deciding where this money is going to go first. I think that not every tenant who is at risk is situated in the same way. And I think one thing that data has provided us is a really clear picture of the communities that were hardest hit by the crisis are the same communities where people were never able to stop going to work, right? People can't work from home. People for whom the reductions in public transportation are devastating. And it's also where the spread is the highest. There are cities that have a 30% infection rate for these reasons. And they're also the places where people are most likely to be living in overcrowded housing, which we know is the top way that this is spreading, is through household spread. And so I think, we need to be smart about the way we do this. We need to give people flexibility with how we're doing these applications. And I think, not thinking about this in the way that this $20 million rental assistance program has always operated, but, we're going to get $430 million of state money that's going to go out. This is a natural disaster that needs to be dealt with in a much different way. And I think this is the reason that we feel like there needs to be a bigger response and a more comprehensive response. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll turn it back over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Andrea. I heard Andrea really throw a big question at Trevor, which is like, who's supposed to pick up the pieces here? So I don't know, Trevor, if you've got the answers, but that's what the $450 million question, right? Like, who's going to cover this? How do we get, over this fiscal hump? And so I hope we'll hear some ideas from Trevor next.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen, and thank you to Professors Hayat and Canstrom for having me today. To Andrea's final point, we are definitely part of that puzzle, and a big and important part, and need to assume responsibility for that piece. So I have a number of slides that I'll move quickly through as well, but in December of 2019, a small internal team at our company started looking at essentially how we operate relative to evictions, and specifically how we could lessen the amount of summary process filings, the beginning process of the legal piece of this in our properties. Win Companies, my organization, we're a large mixed income and affordable housing developer and then property manager. We operate hundreds of communities across the country. We have about 350,000 folks that live in our communities, and our clients, people we manage properties for, are in many cases nonprofit organizations, large and small, community development corporations, resident-owned co-ops. So some of the folks that have been hardest hit by this. My role, my team at our organization we're we're housing-based community organizers, we're program managers, we're resource coordinators, we're embedded in affordable and mixed income housing. And our goal is really helping folks navigate resources more effectively and efficiently, and then really charting the outcomes of programs like childcare and housing stabilization programs and healthcare programs that we have in place in our properties. So some background on our end. In the city of Boston, for about 3 years running, there were about 5,000 eviction cases filed each year. And 70% of those were non-payment cases where residents were unable to pay their rent, which resulted in filing. My organization, we were responsible for 11% of those income restricted eviction filings. And that was not something we liked to see when the city of Boston published its action plan to reduce evictions. You know, and I think an important piece just to set tone here, a backdrop of that, outside of all of the effects of eviction, are that the cost to us as a property manager and an owner are also quite exorbitant. You know, every eviction, when you're weighing bad debt and legal fees and vacancy costs and all of the other financial pieces that go along with it, are costing landlords millions and millions of dollars a year. And just a city like Boston, for us, it was about $2.7 million a year. So we knew that there was a business case for this, far beyond the most important piece of it, which were social implications. So we looked at our 11% in just the city of Boston, and nationally the hundreds of non-payment evictions that are processed each year in our portfolio. We thought a lot about all of the joblessness pre-COVID, the income loss, the rising expenses. Looking at how all of this is compounded in a state like Massachusetts, and then also how it's further compounded by the diminished eligibility for federal assistance programs. So we know evictions are have a negative effects on the social determinants of health. We know that they are disruptive to families, to children, to education, to healthcare. And for landlords across the country, large and small, they're also disruptive to their businesses, their operations, their reputation, their future development work in cities where they are as well. So at the end of 2019, this team we expanded at our organization started working on a housing stability program, not the greatest name in the world, but the focus was really on, we set an initial benchmark of how can we reduce evictions and back into a program that reduces evictions by 50% over the next 5 years. And we started out by looking at components of our operations around how we were engaging people who live in our properties, how we're reaching out, how we're communicating, how we're informing them about the responsibilities as a tenant on one hand, but also on the resources that are available to them as part of living in one of our properties. How we're intervening more upstream. So when we know that residents are consistently paying rent and then suddenly they're not, how we're taking advantage of that moment to reach out, communicate, coordinate financial assistance, how we're integrating payment plans. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but payment plans are not something that are widely done in the housing industry. There's not a consistent way of doing it. They range from back of napkin to poor templates at best for how they're put in place. And then most importantly, when we have hundreds of properties and we have thousands of property managers working across the country, how do we do that consistently? How do we hold our teams accountable to that work? And how do we make sure that that 50% goal is met or exceeded over that period of time? So we looked at the cycle of our operations, from when someone moves into one of our communities to when there were legal intervention, when there was a summary process filing in our portfolio. And we looked at every single piece of what we do along the spectrum of a month or the lifetime of a resident that might lead to eviction. And we really asked ourselves the question, which was, how can we intervene more strategically to stop that? And for us and for the industry as a whole, that's a culture change, that's a political change, that's a business change and a compliance change, but nonetheless, something that we've weighted and makes sense in all of those areas. So when we look at our lease, basically when someone actually moves into one of our communities and they're in affordable housing, you do an initial certification. So your income, your assets, all of this is certified, and that goes to determine what your rent is. And for your average affordable housing renter in a project-based Section 8 community, for example, it's 75 pages. It's a stack of paper. And when you have 2 kids and a moving truck outside waiting, and it's 90 degrees outside in July, you want out of there. That's not an enjoyable experience for anyone on either side of that table. And so how do we take advantage of that moment to make sure that people are clear on resources, the fact that we want to be communicated if and when there's anything that might disrupt your ability to pay rent, let alone anything you might need help with in the community generally. part of that was just a basic notice that we wanted to implement for all of our properties, a refrigerator and everything drawer piece of paper that was tailored to that individual household moving in, what their rent obligation was, what their rent due date was, but also that there were rent frequency options. If you get paid weekly, you could pay your rent weekly. If you run into trouble, here are the resources available to you through our management office that we can help you with. If you need legal representation, here are local, legal counsel. Here's Greater Boston Legal Services and a contact we have there that would absolutely be able to work with you. And also what the process was, what they could expect. If you're an affordable housing renter and you're eligible for an interim certification, like if your income goes down, your rent can be changed because of that. And through COVID, we found that a lot of folks just didn't know that. We took a look at our late payment process. So when someone doesn't pay their rent by the 5th of the month, they don't hear from us really. Again, most property managers don't really do anything. There's not outreach. There's not a late notice that again reminds people of those resources available to them proactively. So people they don't pay their rent and then they get a notice to quit, which is the beginning of a legal process that comes in the middle of the month. There's nothing done in between. So our intervention here was just to simply get out better communication in phone calls as well as reminders to folks about what those resources are at that point in time. Another big piece of this was actually having oversight of this across our portfolio. So we appointed, our portfolio is large in Massachusetts, for example, with hundreds of communities. The idea was to have four or five properties and have someone responsible in the role of a housing stability coordinator as an access point for both residents as well as for our property management staff that was there for brief counseling, was there for mediation services, was there for resource referrals, rent assistance processing, financial coaching if need be, tracking and reporting on the efforts of where we're being successful with these mediations and where we're not. I'll skip by this. Emergency rent assistance. So, as Andrea said, this was a big deal. And to be completely candid, in the housing world amongst landlords, not something most landlords know about, right? They're familiar with programs like RAFT, but prior to COVID, not something that a lot took advantage of. For us, to be very candid, we had about $20,000 in rental assistance that we actually processed on behalf of residents in 2019, and it was pretty consistent year over year prior to that. And today we're at about $3.6 million that we've submitted on behalf of residents in that same cohort of properties. So we became very fluent with these programs. We developed contacts with these agencies. And through the application process, we realized we have 99% of the information that's needed for these applications. Traditionally, the onus of rental assistance is on the household. And again, if English is not your first language and the documentation only exists in 1 or 2 languages, if it's web-based and you don't have access to a computer, if there's a lot of back and forth and you're working 2 jobs, your ability to fill out those applications without a mistake and expect a payment to be coming back to your landlord is not happening, which is one of the reasons why, in the initial RAFT payments during COVID, they were kicking back about 40% of the applications that were submitted because they were submitted with errors, they were submitted without the proper documentation. And affordable housing, mixed income managers, they have all of that information. They have income certifications, asset certifications. It's known. And so our intervention here was we complete the applications and then we review it with the household. And on our batting average, our success at rental assistance, skyrocketed at that point. And we were able to let a lot of residents know that that application we submitted for you last month, your rent is now cured. You're in a better place. And it allowed folks to pivot and focus on the return to work or childcare or any of the thousands of other things on people's minds in this moment. The notice to quit, this is run on the 10th of the month. Folks who have not paid by the 10th of the month soon after receive a notice to quit, which is the beginning of the process that's typically filed at a property level. And so our focus here, because so many folks in affordable housing pay rent when they receive that notice to quit each month, it's an important tool, an important reminder. But by introducing more and beneficial upstream reminders earlier in the month, the notice to quit and how we're actually providing that, we focused more on getting it to people in a formal way, making sure that their housing authorities were alerted to that as well. A lot of residents that their Section 8 vouchers, for example, that are recertified by a housing authority, that communication was not always there. And making sure that our housing stability coordinators are again following up for interventions as folks receive those. Payment plans. again, very candidly, not something that's widely done in the industry whatsoever. Property management systems do not have payment plan templates. And when they're done, and even when they're done in the court systems, they're often punitive. The terms of the payments are 2 months, 3 months. You have to pay all rent that is owed, or else you're moving forward with an eviction. And so our payment plan here was structuring actual templates that were based on actual income, actual assets, actual expenses for the household, and fully fleshing those out in a template so we could come up with balances that actually could be achieved each month, and prolonging the terms of that payment, so that if a household required 9 months or a year to make that payment, that we were able to help them do that and relieve, again, the stress of that process. It could end the immediate legal action right there and then, and eliminate the need for summary process filing and legal expenses and all of the costs of moving into that process, but then also allow us to do this consistently across our portfolio. And then lastly, the summary process in the housing court system. So in this process, many of the attorneys that work with our properties might have been a little worried here, because we're trying to cut their work in half from their perspective. And so the idea was to engage legal counsel that were working in housing court systems on behalf of our properties, and have them work more upstream. Their billable hours to be consumed by rent support and payment plans that are responsible to the resident, and helping residents be assisted in finding legal counsel, so they're not walking in there without any guard whatsoever. And so what we've done is activated our legal counsel across the country so that they're engaging more upstream, that they're providing people access to payment plans and they're authorized to complete those, that they're helping residents circle back with us about rent support where they're eligible, that folks that would be eligible for an interim recertification, for example, where their rent could be adjusted based on job or income loss, are getting back to our offices so we can make those changes and put them in place and alleviate that rent burden, the tenant portion that had added up. And then entering into those payment agreements at that point to, again, stop the legal processing. So the general goal was inserting a series of interventions into our typical collections process that allowed people to be prevented from moving forward to a process that typically is just going to happen because those interventions are not being made. So lot more to say, but I will yield my time over and pass things off back to Professor Hayat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Listening to your presentation, it strikes me that what a lot of commentators and observers of what's happened in the eviction context post-COVID or during COVID really has just illuminated the flaws in the process pre-COVID, right? And it seems that the process that Win Companies is engaged in is like setting new standards for best practices, even outside of the emergency situation that we're in. And that's the best we can all hope for, is that a new normal in how tenants are dealt with, and how their issues are seen could come out of all of this stress and strife. So we'll look to hear more from Trevor on that. Last but not least, Katie will share with us some of the work that her organization has been doing.
Thank you so much, Professor Hayat and the Rappaport Center. I'm going to share my screen. I think that, Trevor, if you're able to stop sharing your screen, I will need to.
Yeah, Katie, I apologize. I selected stop sharing and it just seems to be frozen.
Let me see if I can help.
Okay, it's saying, I think, yeah, it's saying, oh wait, I think I can do it. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Hayat and the Rappaport Center. So I'm going to be talking about how City Life Vida Urbana, a grassroots community organization in Boston, is organizing to keep tenants and homeowners in their homes, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So City Life is a grassroots community organization committed to fighting for racial, social, and economic justice and gender equality by building working class power. We promote individual empowerment, develop community leaders, and build collective power to affect systemic change and transform society. And we do this through a model that we call the sword, the shield, and the offer. The sword is public pressure that we put on corporate landlords and banks in order to build tenant associations and bring landlords and banks to negotiate in order for tenants and homeowners to stay in their homes. The shield is our legal defense, our legal partners who we work closely with in order to defend people in housing court. And we use the sword and the shield together in order to get the offer. And the offer is long-term solutions to housing stability. So this can look like getting buildings out of the market and getting an owner who's trying to evict to sell to a nonprofit such as a community land trust or a community development corporation that will keep the housing permanently affordable for current and future residents. It can also look like long-term contracts, like the residents at Morton Village in Mattapan recently organized and won a contract for 5 years with 3% rent increases, and other tenants like those at Fairlawn Apartments in Mattapan are also organizing for a similar contract, or winning legislation, which Andrea spoke about, and I'll talk more about as well. And so this displacement crisis is disproportionately impacting communities of color and is rooted in historical racism, including practices such as redlining. And the evictions both during and before the pandemic are happening disproportionately in communities of color, in communities that were redlined. We have a research report that's one of the links in the resource document to a report that we put out last summer called Evictions in Boston, the disproportionate effects of forced moves on communities of color. Some of the findings that it found were that over 2/3 of market rate eviction filings in census tracts in Boston were in census tracts where the majority of residents were people of color. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, before the eviction moratorium, over 3/4 of all evictions filed in Boston were in census tracts where the majority of residents are people of color. And we know that this is happening because of the way that the market works. The market is displacing working class communities of color, and that's why we need strong protections at every level, at the local, state, and federal level, to prevent residents from being displaced from their homes. And human needs need to be prioritized over profits of investors and companies. And we also need strong protections beyond the pandemic, such as rent control and just cause eviction protections. And so during the pandemic, we have been continuing to organize and building tenant associations in buildings and having socially distanced actions. One of the major gaps that we are seeing in the federal moratorium is that renters who are facing NoFault evictions are not covered. So we're seeing a lot of buildings where tenants are facing NoFault evictions and are at risk of becoming homeless. These photos here are from a recent candlelight vigil that we had outside of a building where all of the renters are facing NoFault evictions. They're frontline workers. One of them recently recovered from COVID-19. And so this is a major crisis, and we are continuing to organize and build tenant associations to respond to it. And so throughout the pandemic, we've also been organizing to win legislation and protections. The eviction moratorium that we won in April was a result of a lot of organizing throughout the beginning of the pandemic. This photo is from an action we had at Housing Court on March 12th, right at the beginning, calling for a moratorium. And as Andrea spoke about, we're continuing to to organize for legislation at the state level. We're also part of the Rights to the City Alliance nationally, and we are fighting for the Housing is the Cure platform, which includes enhancing and extending the existing federal CDC moratorium to include things such as no-fault evictions, to remove the declaration requirement that a lot of tenants don't know about in time, and to stop all stages of the eviction process, because we know that even just the notice to quit or the eviction filing is often enough to make someone leave their home and become homeless. And this platform also covers stopping utility shutoffs and prioritizing DOJ resources to enforce the moratorium. And we're also, our protections at the state level, we are fighting for protections both for tenants and for homeowners, such as forbearance for homeowners. So we want to make sure that both tenants and small owners are able to stay in their homes. And so we have a hotline that if you know anyone who is facing eviction or foreclosure or having any other type of housing crisis, please share this resource with them. Also in the resource document, there are links to our resource web pages where people can also find information about the CDC declaration and about applying for rental assistance. We're also having weekly online meetings in both English and Spanish where people can get connected to the movement, have meetings with a lawyer, and also really find solidarity and community. And so a lot of renters and homeowners come to us to be a part of that community, whether they're currently facing a housing crisis or whether their housing crisis has resolved or whether they want to support other members of their community. And so, as we know, housing stability is a public health issue, and it has been long before the pandemic, and even more so now. A recent study found that lifting state eviction moratoriums and allowing eviction proceedings to continue caused as many as 433,700 excess cases of COVID-19 and 10,700 additional deaths in the US from March to November of 2020. And so now more than ever, evictions are a danger to public health, and no non-emergency evictions should be happening. No one should be displaced from their home and not be able to safely distance during a pandemic. And so this is why we need strong protections for renters and homeowners so that everyone can be safe during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And to all of the panelists, the queue is very active, so we're just going to dive right into the conversation that has already started there. Something that I think flows from Katie's presentation and also Trevor's is this balance between, corporate interest or landowner interest. And I think this also arose in Callie's presentation about foreclosures and whether that's the next wave. And there seems to be question in the chat about what to do with your smaller than Win Company's landlord that doesn't have the resources of a company as big as Win to maybe weather the storm with the kind of innovations that Trevor just described to us. And you mentioned, Katie, in your presentation, the small, maybe individual owner. And there seems to be something that we haven't spoken to that's maybe in between that, right? And what do the panelists, what do you all suggest? And also, I think, in terms of building coalition or interest convergence between, landlords who don't want to lose their tenants and but who need to pay their bills, and someone put in the chat they also have to pay their taxes and their insurance and their utilities, and do you all have some thoughts on how these two groups can maybe work together, or what is the next step for protecting that group of people? Does anyone want to jump in and grab that question?
Yeah, I think there is more collaboration now than I can ever remember between landlords, resident leadership organizations, city and state agencies, advocacy groups, legal services groups, in every state where we operate. I think everyone's looking for an answer and trying to navigate how this is going to work, because it's a giant mess. I think the examples of what we've seen that are really promising are we've worked with legal services organizations in Jersey City, and in Jersey City, the legal aid attorneys, after meeting with our teams and realizing that we could complete and submit rental assistance applications on behalf of residents, but the residents there, because it was a new acquisition for us, we had just started managing the property, they didn't trust us. And so we're there waiting, ready, but they didn't trust us. So I think meeting with them and walking through what we're able to do, the access we have to the rental assistance programs in that state, our fluency with them, our ability to do it very efficiently, and to be able to circle back with a family in 30 days and say, your rent is taken care of based on this program and based on your consent to kind of put that through, and activating those advocates who had relationships in the community to kind of dispel their fears. I think that's one example that we've seen growing and growing and growing, where advocates that might be traditionally doing battle with landlords and vice versa, working together, to make sure that residents have better access to those programs, and landlords can, pick up that piece of the puzzle and help.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Trevor. Callie, do you have anything to offer based on your previous experience, maybe in the foreclosure crises of 2008, just in even your forecasting of what might come in COVID times, of where the tenants and the landlords might find common ground in advocating at the state level or the federal level, and to save housing for both sides?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So one thing I would say is, through the expansion of the RAF program, as we've talked about during this time, there is a landlord door for landlords who have under 20 units, where they can apply for emergency rental assistance on behalf of tenants, as long as they have the tenant's consent. Now, again, if you are a landlord that doesn't know about this program, that doesn't help you. So that's a hurdle that we have to overcome. But I think there have been a few innovations, and hopefully more to come. In terms of reflecting back on the Great Recession and thinking about where there might be some synergy moving forward, I think we have a lot more federal money coming in now than we ever did during the Great Recession, which is exciting. But again, we need to make sure that we're spending it in the right places.
Yeah.
So that's something. And one more thing I would just add to, I had something I didn't get a chance to talk about, but in terms of RAFT allocations, they have a top 10 list of communities receiving money. And they're the city of Boston and all the gateway cities in Massachusetts. And 10 years ago, if I had to show you a map of where the foreclosures are happening, it's the exact same places. So in terms of forecasting, I'm hoping that we can be coordinating moving forward, so those communities that often are still coming out of the Great Recession are not impacted even more, to Katie's point.
Right. Your comments and yeah, please, Andrea.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to go back to something Trevor said, which I think, and your question, I think, highlights something really important, which is, in kind of crafting and trying to figure out like what's legislation that makes sense to address this. I think that what you highlighted as far as what is a landlord and what is a homeowner is really a difficult question. And I think, we're excited by, even before Wynn's plan, there was the landlord pledge, and there were like efforts that bigger companies that have a totally different financial structure there are things that they can do. And, a lot of them are receiving some government subsidies, and that gives them more flexibility. And they just have a totally different, cushion to work with. And I think that is one way in which to go at this problem. And I think, I totally agree with Trevor that nationally there's a lot of partnership happening. One of the things that we've been kind of talking about it and had written to DHCD about was, something that's happening in the West Coast, in Oregon and Seattle, where they're making bulk payments to large landlords, just to say, you have a lot of people in your buildings who are probably not paying. A lot of those people probably don't even know what these rental programs are. And why don't we go through your rent rolls, see who's behind? And they canvassed them, they spoke to them, they talked about the options, and they cut one check to one landlord for 150 units. And that saved everybody from the beginning to the end. All the tenants who would have had to complete all this documentation, and people would have had to help them, and the landlord who has to respond to every individual request for rental assistance. So I think we're in this place where we have to think in different ways about how to do this. And I think it's really hard to think about that because there is no kind of uniform landlord. So I think, I also, like Callie, kind of lived through as an attorney, the foreclosure crisis. And I quickly had to pivot from representing tenants to doing a lot of really complex consumer litigation to defend homeowners in foreclosure. And that was a really transformative experience. And I think that's where I started working with the organizing, because we had homeowners and their tenants, walking in the streets to talk to Bank of America to say, you sold me this predatory loan and now 5 families are going to be homeless. And we can't have that happen. And I think Callie's absolutely right that there was a lot of money that went into that, but the money went to the banks and it bailed out the banks, whether or not you think that there are, what happened in the structure there and who's, whether people were taking advantage of the loan that they got or not, or whether they were kind of tricked into taking the advantage of that. There wasn't a lot of help for people who really suffered as a result of that. And I think if you talk to some of the organizers in some of those gateway cities, they will tell you that foreclosure crisis never ended there. There has been no recovery there. And I think that's what you're seeing reflected in these numbers. And so I think what we're trying to do with the bill is to really get at the people who are also members of, there are clients too. There are people who can't pay their taxes. There are people on fixed incomes. They don't want to evict their tenants. They have no means to evict their tenants, but they need the money to pay their bills. And trying to build those protections back in. I think part of the dip that you see in foreclosures now has something to do with, the third or so of loans that are federally backed, but there's no protection for mortgagors of private lenders. And so we're trying to build some of that protection into the state legislation to really head off a foreclosure crisis, which ultimately ends in an eviction crisis. So I think it is very complicated, but I totally agree that there is a tremendous amount of money right now. And I think we have to use it wisely, not just to get it out the door, because then I think that leaves us with what I think is called a structural deficit, where we just kind of go back to where we were before, and the communities that were in big trouble before continue to be in big trouble because that money disappears.
Right. A number of you mentioned in your presentations equity, and Callie called out, I think in her last bullet point, that all of this happened in an equitable way, right? And part of that is information gathering. So I know, we wanted to talk about what's the data out there. And I know there was calls for more transparency in data, more data gathering. What do you see as the barriers to getting the data that may be needed to make sure, as Andrea just says, that this money is used in a way that's truly helpful, that gets into the right households, does the good work that Katie was just talking about? What is the data that is needed, and who has it, and how do we get it so that, quickly, right? Because as you all noted, the money is coming and coming quickly. So does anyone want to speak to that?
I'm happy to start that if others want to join in.
Go ahead, Callie, and then I just.
So I think, we need data about what money is going to households and how it's helping them. So one of the things I talked about really quickly was about local emergency rental assistance funds, which we have over 80 in the Commonwealth. We have a database of them, but a lot of these programs were pulled together at the community level. People don't have time to report on what's going on. So I think for us, kind of as a state and a community, it's thinking about how do we make reporting information easier for people? How do we not put up barriers to that and think about where might they already be reporting on some of this information, and how can we just kind of insert ourselves into that instead of creating an additional barrier for people? So that's one particular thought I have.
Anyone else want to jump in there? On what data we need, where might we get it from? I hear Callie saying we need to make it easier to collect. Is that possible to do all of that in the time that we have?
I think we have to make it possible, unless someone else has something to say. I think we just have to make it possible because we need this information.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add is that I think data and notices to quit is something that's important that is generally missing because so many tenants do leave as soon as they get a notice to quit if they don't know their rights and don't know that they have an option to fight their case in court. So that's one piece that's missing that's really important.
Right. There's a question that came in that really calls for us to think about whether handling this at the local level is the right answer, or is there a larger federal response than just sending the money? Also, there's a question about the local moratoria, and is that valuable? Do you need that to come back, Andrea, or are we past the moratoria and we're looking, in a different direction? So I think people would like to hear, in your presentation, you mentioned that the moratorium ended too prematurely in Massachusetts, right? And so does that mean folks should be advocating for a continued state moratorium, or is Massachusetts past that point? And what of the CDC's moratorium? How long do we need it to last? And how does that play into the financial assistance that's coming from the federal government?
I think there's a lot of different answers to that depending on who you ask. I think, the CDC, I think, took action in some part because as a purely public health matter, it had to stop. There's a lot of people who cannot deal with the job loss, the childcare loss, the working at home, then, having to try to go to, not even getting displaced, but trying to go to court. And then we have this, related homelessness problem that it really is threatening to loom. So I think all these things are related. I think you can ask different economists what the fallout is going to be of a longer moratorium versus, kind of letting things happen now versus getting the rental assistance distributed. And I think in some ways we're suffering from a mismatch of timing. If the rental assistance had happened a lot earlier, I think we could be looking at a different situation. And that's just also all tied up in our COVID response too, so it's hard to answer that. Certainly for the people working on the ground with tenants who are in severe crisis, I think they would tell you in no uncertain terms, we need a comprehensive moratorium. And there are absolutely groups that are calling for a nationwide moratorium until we can feel that we're in a better place with the virus. But I understand the kind of financial picture. And I think that it's not an easy answer just to say, yes, stop it, because obviously that's not the only factor.
Right, that leads to our earlier questions.
Yeah, and I think the local, I took that local question to mean just like local, like there's cities that are now passing their own in the absence of state ones. I think those are helpful to the extent, I have some concerns that some of them are not legal, maybe enforceable. But I think if they stop the displacement, I think some of the ones that are rooted in kind of the police powers of just removing, stopping displacement at the last stage, it helps. It's just not a comprehensive solution.
Yes. I'm looking here. There are a few questions for Trevor about training your colleagues in the field, or how receptive other large landlords are to the model that you shared with us with one of our participants is calling the win model. And, is there receptivity to that? Along with that, in terms of trust, I think picking up on your theme of trust, one of our participants asked about the diversity at win companies in the stabilization program of in terms of building trust inside your own organization, inside and outside of the organization. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on either of those that you want to offer.
Sure. Yeah, I think for us it's a cultural change. I think we're this odd combination of private family owned, affordable housing operator, and then and managing properties on behalf of these different clients, but then also there's the profit of the organization and the business of it itself. So I think the cultural change is something our staff are very receptive to. I think when we walk through the fact that if what happens to someone's voucher when they're executed, or when you process an eviction and all household members are named on that eviction execution, that all of those households have an eviction on their permanent record. I think, people opening their eyes up to the realities of what evictions cause and what we're directly contributing to internally here was, not that it was an easy sell by any means, but people were very receptive to it. I think the training is the hard part, because as Andrea said, each state is different, each city is different. Katie's point earlier about the notice to quit, and cities now requiring that to be on file. I think there's so many different kind of compliance hoops in all of the different states that require us to really focus on states, and then in many cases individual municipality and city trainings. So that's a big lift. I think now there's no better time than now to be doing it, because we are also under the safety umbrella of the COVID relief bill, the $25 billion, the likely passage of billions and billions of dollars of additional assistance. So if you're going to try something like this, there's no better time than now. And our goal is to really, when there is enough money out there that can be accessed to support all folks to be stably in their homes, we can train our staff and normalize these practices by summer 2020, so that it becomes just the way we operate moving forward. And so as the moratorium are lifted, as the individual state programs and people are able to return to work, that it becomes how we operate generally. But it's been a hard lift so far, and we're not even a tenth of the way through of training our teams. But something we're committed to, something that we created accountability mechanisms for. And circling back to your last question, I think things like the notice to quit, having it on file at states, and where is that data housed? I think those mechanisms that are both prohibiting landlords in many cases from easily moving to an eviction process by creating a series of hoops that prevent it, those are also the sources of where that data can be reported from in the future at the city level, at the housing court level, and so on. Because I'll tell you from the landlord's perspective, eviction related data from notices to quit to executions is not something that is at all tracked effectively.
Yeah. There's some questions arising in the chat, and one of them dovetails with a question that's also in the Q&A about discrimination against protected classes, and the question in the chat concerns protection of data by suburban communities in order to not share resources. And these are age-old issues. Again, these are kind of pre-COVID issues that continue to rear their head post-COVID. And, so I think participants are interested in thoughts on how we traverse those historical issues when so much, it seemingly there's so even more at stake than there always is, in terms of, how suburban communities may respond to the relief compared to urban communities in more urban communities in Massachusetts, and what kind of work might be done to shake resources loose in suburban communities. If anyone has any thoughts on that, or are we only thinking about urban centers in terms of this data collection?
I can jump in unless anyone else wants to. And I think that question was from Josephine McNeil, who is a wonderful housing advocate in the city of Newton. So hi, Josephine, and thanks for that question. So I think, suburban communities, and I can send a link afterwards, have been stepping up with the creation of local emergency rental assistance. But as we've talked about before, oftentimes don't need to step up as much because of our history of redlining and racial discrimination in housing in Massachusetts and across the country, right? So I think it's wonderful that many suburban communities have stepped up. In terms of getting the data, unfortunately, since it's local data, it can be harder to get, and that's where kind of meeting people where they are to get that information is something that my organization, the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, is trying to do. We are trying to maintain a database of that. So I just want to say thank you for bringing that to the attention of the entire group, and we are trying our best to get information.
And if I can add two things on the discrimination on the disability and other race discrimination piece, I think that another way in which I think that, like you said, Professor Hayat, the age-old discrimination is happening as it did before. I don't think that the pandemic has changed too much, although I do think there's probably less housing search going on. There may be more vulnerable people in that housing search. I think that the access to the courts is a kind of new hurdle that a lot of places are dealing with because of, there's just like a whole lot there. There's people who don't have a phone, don't have a space to do a Zoom hearing. They can't introduce evidence or documents. And so should they go to court, they're high risk for COVID. So I think this is kind of a new frontier the longer this goes on. And then I think the other piece of that data question is not just about what are the localities doing as far as distributing the rental assistance, but I think there's another kind of bigger structural discrimination question that maybe you were getting at, which is, can we think differently coming out of this crisis about how housing is sited, where people are living? Can we kind of live up to the affirmatively furthering ideals about looking at the structures that created the conditions that kept all of the things happening, the foreclosure crisis, the COVID crisis, the eviction crisis that's happening now, the lack of vaccines and testing. That's not a coincidence, historical coincidence. And so I think, can we use this opportunity to go bigger and do better with that?
Right. Before we end, it's crazy. We've come down to our final minutes together, but I want to go back to a place where we started, which was about the perception of fear and the human cost to this, even beyond just losing your housing before one loses your housing. And if you don't ever lose your housing, just this living not only in pandemic, but in, a really unhealthy space mentally for so many of just thousands and millions of Americans over the fear of what might happen to them. And so I wanted to have you all talk about maybe even Katie, some of the work you're doing. It looks like the vigils are helping keep people in community and helping keep people strengthened to get through this time. And if you just wanted to share more about that or share resources for keeping people healthy and strong while we wait for the money and the data to be collected and, all of this other great work we've heard about.
Thank you. Yes, we're definitely doing a lot to try to support people who are really dealing with so much trauma and crisis. One of the things, our weekly meetings that we used to have in person in Jamaica Plain and East Boston weekly that are now online, those are still a space where a lot of people find a lot of solidarity and support. We've found ways to turn some of our rituals that we had in person, like how we welcome new people and tell them that we'll fight with you when they share their story. So we found ways to do that in virtual spaces and also, really building virtual tenant associations, reaching out to our members, especially people who we hadn't heard from. We're making sure that we're proactively reaching out to everyone. And then, our vigils and actions, we're doing a lot of socially distanced actions and lots of buildings are showing up to support each other. And so like a few weeks ago, we had several vigils of buildings where people were facing no-fault evictions, and the different residents of the buildings came out to support each other. And so we really, that's really a huge part of our work, is that solidarity and support. And it's definitely really important because this is, the eviction process is so traumatic, and really is, the fear of eviction has been shown to have major public health impacts on physical and mental health.
Right. And Matthew Desmond's work showed us some of these impacts, but no one's seen it even in the midst of pandemic, right? So this is, and children at home, is one of our panelists spoke. I mean, there's so many stressors right now in addition to the normal ones. So thank you for that work. I don't know if Professor Canstrom wants to jump in now with the close. We probably have time for one more question, or we could move to our close. Take one more question.
One more if you want.
Okay, sure. There was a new question that came in that talks about, I think, I'm not sure if this is from a landlord or tenant, but wanting to know from Trevor about what if a tenant just cannot pay at all? And I'm not sure if it's a landlord who's thinking about that. How do you deal with not being able to pay at all? The payment plan, it says, sounds promising, but what are we to do in spaces where there really is no income right now? And I don't know if others want to jump in there too.
Yeah, I mean, we've that literally thousands of people that live in our housing, and hundreds of thousands of people, elsewhere, that are in exactly that situation. There's job loss. People have no idea when they're going back to work. There's no certainty whatsoever. Businesses are changing. There will likely be, longer periods of time where this is extended. So I think one of the benefits of affordable housing is its purpose as a safety net of housing. And so when someone can't pay their rent in affordable housing, their income goes, if it goes down to zero, their rent is adjusted down to zero, commensurate with that income. And I think in cases where you have folks that are, quote unquote, market rate renters, folks living in conventional housing that might be paying $5,000 to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the city of Boston, for example, that in job loss in those circumstances during COVID, their income, their area median income, and drops to less than 80%. So they're eligible for rental assistance programs to pay, all or of their rent balances. And I think, cities like Boston, as they expand housing vouchers, and make that more of this idea of more of a housing right, that everyone has a right to housing, and they expand those safety net programs, then hopefully we'll see more and more people that if and where they end up in that situation, shelter is not their only option, that a voucher and high quality affordable housing is something that can be something they can immediately navigate to.
Right. All eyes on Secretary Fudge to see how she's going to advance, if and when the Biden administration will advance this vouchers for all. Thank you for that. That's a good, hopeful place for us to end. And now I speak for everyone in thanking you all for sharing, and I'll turn it over to Professor Canstrom.
Well, Professor Hayat, let me thank you for a wonderful job of moderating and keeping us organized and addressing all the issues. And thanks again to the panelists. This was really a wonderful presentation. I learned a great deal. And more than that, although these problems are obviously profound and can be profoundly demoralizing, I feel inspired by your work. I mean, it's just the sense that when you have people with this level of energy and intelligence and commitment and solidarity, we find ways through it. To everybody who's attending, there's a lot of information in the chat. There is also a live transcript function that is now available that I think you can access it, but also we will have a recording of this entire program available on the Rappaport Center website. To the students who are watching, I would just want to say, follow these people as models, get engaged, maybe even reach out to them. Some of them might be looking for some legal help or some research help, or just, keep in touch. And please watch this space for future programming. We have programs coming up on educational equity, litigation, policy solutions, democratic accountability, and a variety of other things. So keep in touch with the Rappaport Center. And as I said at the beginning to the panelists, We haven't paid you anything, but we owe you a great debt of gratitude, and we will certainly repay you someday with food or drink or good support. Thanks to all for joining us. Thank you.